If you step into the wrong carriage on a night like this, it may not be a mistake at all. The wind did not simply blow. It roared across the open road like something alive, clawing at Eliza Hartwell's thin cloak as snow swallowed her boots with every desperate step, the cold biting through wool and bone alike until her breath came in shallow, burning gasps that barely reached her lungs. And somewhere in the distance, half hidden behind the white chaos, a dark shape emerged, still and silent against the storm, a carriage, its lantern dim but steady, like an invitation she had no strength left to question, and without thinking, without pausing to consider why it waited there alone in such merciless weather, she ran, her gloved hand slipping once against the frozen handle before she forced the door open and collapsed inside, dragging the storm in with her before slamming it shut, sealing herself into sudden, suffocating warmth, her heart pounding so violently it echoed in her ears. And for one fragile second she thought she was safe, until she looked up and realized she was not alone. The man across from her had not moved, not even as she entered, as though he had been expecting her, his presence filling the small space with something heavier than silence, something controlled and dangerous and utterly still, his dark coat untouched by snow, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget the cold entirely. And in that moment Eliza understood that she had not escaped the storm at all. She had merely stepped into something far more uncertain. "You've come a long way to choose the wrong carriage," he said at last, his voice low and measured, each word falling with quiet precision, and she opened her mouth to explain, to apologize, to say anything that might undo the mistake already tightening around her. But the carriage lurched forward before she could speak, the wheels grinding through snow as though no storm could slow them, and panic flickered sharp and sudden in her chest. I'm sorry, sir, I thought this was," she began, but his gaze did not soften, did not shift, it simply held her there, pinned in place by something she could not name. "It is not," he replied, and the finality in his tone silenced her more effectively than any raised voice could have. Outside, the wind screamed louder, but inside, the air had grown strangely still, as if the world itself had narrowed to this dim carriage and the man who watched her like a question he had not yet decided how to answer. Eliza's fingers tightened around her worn bag, her thoughts racing toward escape, toward the door, toward any option that might return her to the life she had known only minutes before. But when she reached for the handle, the carriage did not slow, did not turn, and his voice came again, softer now, but far more unsettling. "Opening that door would be unwise," he said, and something in the way he spoke made her pause, not out of obedience, but because she suddenly believed him, truly believed that whatever waited beyond that door was no longer her greatest danger. And as the carriage pressed deeper into the storm, the faint outline of something vast and dark began to rise through the snow ahead, jagged against the sky like a shadow given form, and Eliza felt a quiet, unshakable certainty settle over her heart that she had not been saved tonight, she had been claimed. The carriage did not slow as the storm grew louder, as though the world beyond its walls had no power over the path already chosen, and Eliza sat frozen across from him, her breath finally steadying, but her thoughts anything but calm, every instinct urging her to speak again, to demand answers, to reclaim some measure of control, yet something in his stillness held her back. Not fear exactly, but the quiet understanding that this was not a man who explained himself easily. The lantern above them flickered once, casting shadows that moved across his face and revealed nothing except the sharp line of his jaw and the unwavering focus of his gaze. "Where are you taking me?" she asked at last, her voice softer than she intended, careful, measured, as though too much force might shatter whatever fragile balance existed between them. He did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched long enough that she thought he might ignore the question entirely, but then his eyes shifted, slightly, not away from her, but beyond her, toward the frost-covered window where the outline of that looming structure grew clearer with every passing second. "Home," he said, and the word did not comfort her, not in the way it should have, because there was no warmth in it, no welcome, only something distant and final, as though the place he spoke of was less a refuge and more a certainty that could not be undone. Eliza followed his gaze despite herself, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her skirt as the shape outside emerged fully from the storm. Towering walls of dark stone rising from the snow like something ancient and unyielding, its windows dim, its edges sharp. Against the sky, not ruined, not abandoned, but silent in a way that suggested it had been waiting far longer than she had been alive. "That is not a home," she whispered before she could stop herself, and for the first time, something in his expression changed, not enough to soften him, but enough to reveal a flicker of something beneath the surface, something that might have been recognition, or perhaps resignation. "No," he said quietly, "it is not." The carriage began to slow as they approached the massive iron gates, their black bars rising high and rigid, dusted with snow that did not dare linger for long. As if even the storm hesitated here, and without a word from him, the gates opened, not with force, but with a slow, deliberate movement that echoed through the cold air like a decision already made. Eliza felt her heartbeat quicken again, not from the cold this time, but from the undeniable realization that there would be no easy departure from whatever lay beyond those gates. The carriage rolled forward, the sound of wheels against stone replacing the muffled crunch of snow. And as they passed through the entrance, she noticed something that made her chest tighten. There were no lights welcoming them, no signs of life in the windows, only darkness and the faint glow of a single lantern near the entrance, waiting, as though someone knew they would arrive at this exact moment. "I should not be here," she said, more to herself than to him. But he heard her. Of course he did, and his answer came without hesitation, calm and certain in a way that left no room for argument. "No," he said again, his voice lower now, almost lost beneath the fading wind. "You should not." The carriage came to a complete stop at the foot of the stone steps, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence between them deeper than before, heavier, as though something unseen had settled into place around them. Eliza glanced toward the door, then back at him, waiting, uncertain whether she was meant to leave or remain, and then he spoke once more, his words quiet, but carrying a weight she could not ignore. "But you are," he said, and as the door opened, the cold air rushed in again, sharp and immediate, yet it felt different now, less like an enemy and more like a threshold, and somewhere deep within her, a thought formed that she could not quite explain, that stepping out of this carriage would not return her to the storm she had fled, but would carry her further into something she did not yet understand. The cold struck her the moment she stepped down from the carriage, sharper than before, as if the air itself had changed beyond the gates, and Eliza hesitated at the base of the stone steps, her boots meeting solid ground that no longer gave beneath her weight, the storm still raging behind her, yet somehow quieter here, as though the towering walls absorbed its fury and left only a distant echo. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to shield her from the strange stillness settling over her senses, and when she looked back, the carriage door had already closed, sealing away the only path she had known. The man descended after her with measured ease, his presence steady, controlled, untouched by the cold that seemed to reach for everything else, and for a brief moment they stood side by side without speaking, both facing the looming entrance, as if acknowledging something neither of them needed to name. The massive wooden doors opened before either of them moved, not abruptly, but with a slow, deliberate motion that revealed a dimly lit hall beyond, warm light flickering from distant candles, yet failing to soften the weight of the space. And Eliza felt it immediately, not fear, not exactly, but a quiet awareness that she had crossed into a place where every sound, every movement, would matter more than it should. "You may enter," he said, his voice calm, almost indifferent, yet it carried the unmistakable authority of someone who was not accustomed to repeating himself. She stepped forward because there was nothing else to do, her breath catching slightly as the warmth wrapped around her, not comforting, but heavy, like a blanket that had been left untouched for too long. The doors closed behind them with a muted finality that echoed deeper than the sound itself, and Eliza turned instinctively, as though expecting them to open again, but they did not. Of course they did not, and when she faced forward once more, she realized she was no longer alone in the vast entrance hall. A single figure stood at a distance, still and composed, watching them with quiet attention, an older man dressed in dark formal attire, his posture impeccable, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes lingered on Eliza just a fraction longer than necessary, as though measuring something unseen. "Your Grace," he said with a slight bow, his voice smooth, controlled, acknowledging the man beside her before shifting back to her with a subtle curiosity that he did not attempt to hide. An unexpected arrival. Eliza felt the weight of those words settle over her. Unexpected, uninvited, out of place. And yet here she stood, inside walls that did not belong to her, beneath a roof she had never intended to see. "She will remain until the storm passes," the Duke replied, his tone leaving no room for question or interpretation, and the man inclined his head once more, accepting the statement without hesitation, though something in his gaze suggested he understood more than had been said. "Of course, Your Grace," he answered, before turning slightly, gesturing toward a corridor that stretched into shadow. "A room will be prepared." Eliza followed the direction of his gesture, her eyes tracing the length of the hallway, noting how the candlelight seemed to fade rather than extend, as though the darkness itself resisted intrusion, and for a fleeting second, she wondered how far that corridor truly went, and what lay beyond the places meant to be seen. "You will rest," the Duke said beside her, his voice lower now, closer, enough that she could feel the presence of him without turning her head. "Tomorrow, we will decide what is to be done." Eliza nodded slowly, though the words did little to ease the quiet unease growing within her, because something in the way he spoke made it clear that whatever decision awaited her would not be as simple as leaving. And as she took her first step toward the corridor, she felt it again, that same unshakable certainty, that this place was not merely a shelter from the storm, but something far more intricate, something that had already begun to close around her the moment she stepped inside. The corridor stretched longer than it should have, each step echoing softly beneath Eliza's boots as though the stone itself was listening. The man who had greeted them moved ahead with quiet efficiency, a single candle held steady in his hand, its flame casting narrow light that revealed just enough and nothing more, and Eliza followed because there was no other path offered to her, though she could not ignore the way the shadows seemed to gather just beyond the reach of that light, as if they had weight, as if they watched. She glanced once over her shoulder, half expecting to see the Duke behind her, but he was no longer there, his absence as deliberate as his presence had been, leaving her with the strange sensation that she had been handed over rather than welcomed. "You must forgive the state of the house," the man said at last, his voice calm, measured, as though speaking into silence was a habit long formed. "It has not entertained guests in quite some time." Eliza hesitated before answering, unsure whether this counted as conversation or something more formal. "I am not certain I should be counted as a guest," she replied carefully, and for the briefest moment, something almost resembling a smile touched his expression, though it did not reach his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "I imagine not." They continued in silence after that, the air growing warmer, yet somehow heavier, and as they turned a corner, Eliza noticed the first detail that unsettled her more than the others. The walls here were lined with portraits, tall and narrow, each framed in dark wood, their painted subjects dressed in elegance that spoke of generations long past. But what held her attention was not their presence, it was their absence of attention. None of the eyes followed her, none of the faces seemed aware, as though the life that once filled them had been carefully removed, leaving only form behind. She slowed without meaning to, her gaze lingering on one portrait in particular. A woman with pale features and composed posture, her expression unreadable, yet there was something in the way she was painted, something unfinished, as if the artist had stopped before capturing what truly mattered. "We do not linger here," the man said, not sharply, but firmly enough to draw her forward again, and Eliza obeyed without question, though the image stayed with her. Pressing quietly at the edge of her thoughts, they reached a door at last. Simple in comparison to the rest of the house, its surface unadorned, its handle worn by use rather than display, and the man paused before opening it, turning to face her fully for the first time since they had entered the corridor. "You will find this room suitable for the night," he said, his tone neither warm nor cold, simply factual. "A fire has been lit, and dry garments will be provided." Eliza nodded, though her attention shifted briefly beyond him, further down the corridor where the darkness deepened, and for a moment she thought she saw another door at the far end. Larger, heavier, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Something about it drawing her gaze in a way she could not explain. "That wing is not in use," the man added, as if answering a question she had not spoken aloud, and Eliza blinked, startled by the quiet precision of his observation. "You are not to go there," he continued, still calm, still measured, but the weight behind the words had changed. Not a suggestion, not a warning, but something closer to a rule that had been broken before and would not be broken again. Eliza forced her gaze back to him, inclining her head slightly. "I understand," she said, though she was not entirely certain that she did, and the man studied her for a moment longer, as if deciding whether that answer was sufficient, before opening the door at last. The warmth inside met her immediately, the crackling of fire soft and steady, a small room, but carefully arranged, offering a sense of order that the rest of the house seemed to resist. "You may rest," he said, stepping aside to allow her entry. And as Eliza crossed the threshold, she felt the shift again, subtle, but undeniable, as though each door in this place marked a deeper step inward, not just through space, but into something she had yet to understand. And as the door closed quietly behind her, she realized with a slow, steady breath that the storm outside had been loud and merciless. But here, within these walls, the silence might prove far more difficult to endure. The fire had been prepared with careful precision, its steady glow casting soft light across the small room. And for the first time since stepping into the storm, Eliza felt something close to stillness settle over her, though it was not comfort, not entirely, but rather a pause, as if the world had drawn a quiet breath and was waiting to see what she would do next. She removed her gloves slowly, her fingers stiff and pale from the cold, holding them briefly toward the warmth as sensation returned in faint, tingling waves. And yet even here, even in this contained space, she could not ignore the subtle awareness that the walls did not belong to her, that every object, every flicker of light, existed within a structure she did not understand. Her gaze moved across the room with quiet attention, noting the careful arrangement of furnishings, the absence of anything unnecessary, a bed neatly prepared, a small table beside it, a basin filled with warm water that still released faint curls of steam into the air, everything placed with purpose, yet nothing personal, no trace of the life that must pass through these halls. As if even rest here had been reduced to function rather than comfort, she stepped closer to the fire, extending her hands toward it, watching the flames shift and bend in silence. And for a brief moment she allowed herself to close her eyes, to listen not to the storm, which now felt distant and removed, but to the quiet crackle of burning wood, the only sound that seemed willing to remain. But the stillness did not last. It never did, because beneath it, there was something else, something she could not yet name, a faint unease that pressed gently at the edges of her thoughts. And when she opened her eyes again, it was not the room she saw first, but the door, closed, solid, final, and she found herself staring at it longer than she intended, as though expecting it to open again without warning, as though someone might enter without sound. She exhaled slowly, turning away from the thought, forcing her attention elsewhere, to the garments laid out for her on the chair, simple, clean, chosen with a practicality that spoke of careful observation rather than hospitality, and she hesitated only briefly before reaching for them, understanding that whatever place she had entered, it was one that expected compliance, not resistance. The fabric was warm against her skin, a quiet relief after the cold that had clung to her for hours, and yet, even as she changed, she could not shake the sense that she was being watched, not directly, not in any visible way, but in the subtle, lingering manner of a house that held memory within its walls. She moved quickly after that, as though finishing the task would restore some measure of control, and when she was done, she stepped back toward the fire once more, her posture still, composed, but her thoughts far from settled. The man's words echoed in her mind, not as instructions, but as boundaries. "You will rest. Tomorrow we will decide." And it was that final phrase that lingered most, decide. What is to be done? as though her presence here required consideration, as though leaving was not as simple as opening a door and stepping back into the world she had known. She crossed the room slowly, lowering herself onto the edge of the bed, her gaze drifting once more to the window, where the faint outline of the storm remained visible beyond the glass, distant now, contained, and yet she could not bring herself to feel reassured, because the storm had been honest in its intent, loud, relentless, visible in every gust of wind and falling snow, while this place, this quiet, measured world of stone and shadow, concealed far more than it revealed. And as she lay back against the pillows, her body finally beginning to yield to exhaustion, she understood with a clarity that unsettled her more than anything else, that whatever awaited her beyond this room, beyond this night, it would not be shaped by chance, but by something far more deliberate, something that had already begun to unfold the moment she stepped into that carriage. And as the fire burned steadily beside her, casting light that never quite reached the corners of the room, Eliza closed her eyes not in peace, but in quiet awareness that sleep here would not be an escape, but merely a pause before whatever came next. Sleep did not come easily, not in the way it should have after exhaustion, because even as Eliza's body surrendered to stillness, her mind remained alert beneath the surface, drifting only lightly before pulling her back again, as though some quiet part of her refused to fully rest within walls she did not trust. The fire had burned lower, its steady glow reduced to softer embers that cast long, uncertain shadows across the room. And it was those shadows that seemed to shift first, not with movement she could see, but with a presence she could feel, subtle and persistent, until her eyes opened slowly into the dimness, her breath shallow, her senses sharpening without knowing why. For a moment she remained still, listening, the silence deeper now, heavier than before, pressing against her ears until even the smallest sound carried weight. And then she heard it, not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable, the faintest echo of something beyond the door, a distant footstep, measured and slow, followed by another, and then nothing, as if whoever moved through the corridor had paused, had chosen stillness over continuation. Eliza pushed herself up slightly, her hand instinctively tightening against the fabric of the blanket, her gaze fixed on the door as though it might reveal more than its quiet surface allowed. She told herself it was nothing, that a house of this size could not remain entirely empty, that movement was natural, expected, and yet the feeling that settled in her chest refused to ease, because the sound had not felt like routine, it had felt deliberate, as though the silence that followed had meaning. She swung her legs carefully over the side of the bed, her feet meeting the cold floor with a softness that barely disturbed the air, every movement measured now, controlled, as though the house itself required a certain restraint, and for a moment she considered remaining where she was, waiting for morning, for light, for clarity that would make sense of everything she had begun to question, but the thought did not hold, because curiosity, quiet and persistent, had already taken root. She crossed the small distance to the door, her hand hovering near the handle without immediately touching it, listening again, and when no further sound came, she drew a slow breath and turned it gently, the latch yielding without resistance, the door opening just enough to reveal the corridor beyond, darker now than before, the candles fewer, their light reduced to faint glows that barely reached the floor. Eliza stepped forward, her presence cautious, her eyes adjusting slowly as she moved beyond the threshold. And the moment she did, the air changed again, cooler, quieter, as though she had left behind the only space intended for comfort. She closed the door behind her without thinking, the soft click echoing more than it should have, and for a brief second she hesitated, aware that she had crossed another unseen boundary, yet unable to return to the bed she had just left. Her gaze shifted down the length of the corridor, drawn once more toward that distant end where the darkness gathered more completely, where the outline of that larger door lingered just beyond clear sight. And though she remembered the warning, the quiet certainty in the man's voice, "You are not to go there," she found her steps moving forward regardless, slow at first, careful, as though she could still turn back at any moment. But with each step the pull strengthened, not forceful, not urgent, but steady, like something waiting patiently to be found. The silence deepened around her, absorbing even the sound of her own breathing, until it felt as though the entire house had shifted to accommodate her movement. And when she finally stopped, just short of where the shadows thickened, she realized with a quiet, unsettling clarity that whatever lay beyond that unseen threshold had not been hidden to keep her safe, but to keep something else contained. And for the first time since entering those gates, Eliza understood that the true nature of this place was not in its coldness, nor in its silence, but in the things it chose not to reveal until someone stepped far enough to see them. The air grew colder with every step she took, though no wind touched her, no draft brushed against her skin, and Eliza slowed instinctively, her breath quiet, her senses sharpened by something deeper than fear, because this part of the house did not feel abandoned. It felt aware. The shadows here did not simply gather, they held, as though they had been waiting longer than the rest of the manor dared to admit. And when she finally reached the place where the corridor narrowed and the darkness settled into something almost tangible, she saw it clearly for the first time. The door, taller than the others, heavier in its presence, its surface dark and unadorned except for the faint outline of age worn into the wood. And something about it made her pause before even thinking to move closer, not because it threatened her, but because it seemed to exist outside the rest of the house, as though it belonged to a different time, a different purpose. Eliza stood there for a moment, her hand resting lightly at her side, her eyes fixed on the door as if expecting it to react to her attention. But it remained still, silent, closed, and yet the silence here was not empty. It pressed inward, steady and patient, and she became aware of something else then, something so faint she might have missed it had she not been listening so carefully. A sound, distant and uneven, not quite a voice, not quite movement, but something in between, as though the air itself carried the memory of something that had not fully faded. Her breath caught slightly, her fingers tightening unconsciously as she leaned forward just a fraction, drawn closer not by curiosity alone, but by the strange certainty that whatever lay beyond that door had already begun to reach toward her in ways she could not yet understand. "You were told not to come here." The voice behind her was quiet, not raised, not sharp, but it struck with precision, and Eliza turned quickly, her heart skipping once before steadying again as she met his gaze. The Duke stood, several feet behind her, his presence as controlled as ever. Yet there was something different now, something less distant, more immediate, as though the space between them had narrowed without her noticing. She did not speak at once, because there was no simple answer to offer, no explanation that would justify the path her steps had taken, and yet she did not look away, did not retreat. Instead she held his gaze with a quiet steadiness that surprised even herself. "I heard something," she said at last, her voice low, not defensive, not uncertain, simply honest, and for a moment, something shifted in his expression, not enough to soften him, but enough to acknowledge that she had not spoken without thought. His eyes moved briefly toward the door before returning to her, and in that small movement, Eliza understood that she had not imagined what she felt, that there was something here, something known to him, something he had chosen not to reveal. "This part of the house is not for guests," he said, his tone even, but the weight behind it unmistakable, and Eliza tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet recognition of the truth beneath his words. "You said I was not a guest," she replied, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before, deeper, more deliberate, as though her words had touched something he had not expected her to see. The Duke did not answer immediately, his gaze holding hers in a way that felt less like scrutiny and more like consideration, and then, slowly, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them with measured ease, stopping just close enough that she could feel the quiet intensity of his presence without needing to move. "That does not mean you belong here either," he said, his voice softer now, but no, less certain, and Eliza felt the meaning settle between them, not as a warning, but as something far more complex, something that did not fit easily into fear or safety. And for the first time since entering the manor, she realized that the boundaries within this place were not simply meant to keep her out, but to keep something else contained, something that even he did not fully control. Her gaze flickered once more toward the door, and though she did not step closer again, she knew with quiet certainty that whatever lay beyond it had not finished with her. And as she turned back toward him, the silence between them held a new weight, not of distance, but of something unspoken beginning to take shape. The silence between them did not break. It deepened, settling into something that neither of them seemed willing to disturb. And Eliza became aware of how close he stood, not enough to touch, but enough that his presence shaped the air around her, steady, controlled, and far more unsettling than distance would have been. She held his gaze without stepping back, though her heartbeat had begun to shift, slower now, more deliberate, as if it had learned that sudden movement had no place here. The door remained behind her, silent, closed, yet no longer distant. It felt nearer now, not in space, but in awareness, as though whatever lay beyond it had drawn closer simply because it had been acknowledged. "What is in there?" she asked, her voice quiet, not demanding, not reckless, but unwilling to retreat into ignorance. The Duke's expression did not change, not immediately, but his eyes moved again, briefly, toward the door, and in that single motion, Eliza understood that her question had not been unexpected, only unwanted. "Nothing that concerns you," he replied, the words measured, precise, yet lacking the finality she had expected, and she noticed it, that slight absence of certainty, the smallest fracture in an otherwise controlled response. She tilted her head slightly, studying him now as carefully as he had once studied her. "You are certain of that?" she asked, and for a moment, something passed between them, not conflict, not agreement, but recognition. As though he saw in her question something he could not easily dismiss, the silence stretched again. But this time it did not feel empty. It felt like a space where truth might surface if allowed. And then he exhaled, slowly, not in frustration, but in something closer to acceptance. "This house was not always as it is now," he said, his voice lower, less guarded, though still carefully restrained. Eliza did not interrupt, did not press further, because she understood that whatever he chose to say next would not come easily. And when he spoke again, his words carried a weight that did not belong to the present alone. "There are parts of it that remain unchanged," he continued, "parts that were never meant to be opened again." Eliza's gaze flickered once more toward the door, and this time she did not try to hide it, because the truth had already taken shape within her thoughts. This was not about disuse, not about forgotten corridors or abandoned rooms. This was something deliberate, something maintained. "And yet you keep it," she said softly, and the question beneath her words did not need to be spoken aloud. "Why?" The Duke's eyes returned to hers, and for the first time since she had met him, there was no distance in his gaze, only something quiet and unguarded that he did not seem able to conceal. "Because some things do not remain closed simply because we wish them to," he said, and the honesty in his voice unsettled her more than any warning could have. She felt it then, not as fear, but as understanding, that whatever lay beyond that door was not entirely contained, that its presence extended beyond wood and lock, woven into the very stillness of the house itself. And for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them holding something new now, not tension, but awareness, shared and unspoken. Eliza lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in thought, because the choice before her had begun to take form. She could return to her room, to the small space offered to her, to the illusion of distance from whatever this place concealed, or she could remain here, at the edge of something she did not yet understand, and though the safer path was clear, it did not hold her, because somewhere beneath the uncertainty, there was a pull she could not deny, not toward danger, but toward truth. She looked back at him then, her expression steady, her voice calm. "Then perhaps it is not meant to remain closed forever," she said, and the words lingered between them, not as a challenge, but as a possibility, and the Duke did not answer, not immediately, but something in his gaze shifted once more, not resistance, not agreement, but something far more uncertain, as though for the first time, he was no longer entirely certain which boundaries should remain unbroken. The possibility she had spoken did not fade. It remained between them, quiet and persistent, and Eliza saw the exact moment it unsettled him, not through any visible reaction, but through the subtle stillness that followed. As if even his control required a brief pause to adjust, his gaze did not leave hers, Yet something within it shifted, not weakness, not surrender, but the recognition of a truth he had not allowed himself to consider. And in that moment, the distance between them changed. Not physically, but in a way that felt far more significant, because for the first time, she was no longer simply someone who had entered his world by accident. She had become someone who could see it, and that realization did not sit easily with him. "You speak as though you understand what lies beyond that door," he said at last, his voice measured, though the edge beneath it was no longer entirely concealed. And Eliza did not answer immediately, not because she lacked a response, but because she understood the weight of what she might say. Understanding did not require knowledge, it required awareness, and that was something she could not deny. "I do not understand it," she replied quietly, "but I can feel that it does not belong to silence." The words settled into the space between them with a quiet certainty that could not be easily dismissed, and for a moment, neither of them moved, as though both were aware that something had shifted beyond simple conversation. The Duke's gaze lowered briefly, not in avoidance, but in thought, and when he looked back at her, there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not distance, not restraint, but something closer to conflict, as though the boundaries he had relied upon were no longer as fixed as he had believed. "There was a time," he said slowly, his voice quieter now, carrying a depth that had not been present before, "when this house was filled with light, when every door stood open, when nothing within these walls required silence to remain contained." Eliza listened without interruption, her attention steady, because she understood that what he offered now was not explanation, but memory, and memory carried its own kind of truth. "That time has passed," he continued, and though his tone remained controlled, there was something beneath it, something that spoke not of acceptance, but of something unresolved, something unfinished. Eliza's gaze moved once more toward the door, and this time she did not hesitate to speak what had already formed within her thoughts. "Then why has it not been left behind?" she asked, her voice soft, yet unwavering, and the question did not seek to challenge, only to understand. The Duke's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something far more restrained, something that required effort to contain. "Because not everything that ends truly leaves us," he said, and the weight of those words settled heavily into the silence that followed. Eliza felt it then, not as a revelation, but as a quiet alignment of everything she had sensed since entering the manor, the stillness, the shadows, the careful control that seemed to hold every part of this place together. This was not simply a house with closed doors, it was a place shaped by something that had never fully faded, something that remained, not as a presence to be feared, but as something that had never been released. She turned back to him slowly, her expression thoughtful, her voice calm. "And you believe it should remain that way?" she asked, and the question lingered longer than the others, not because it demanded an answer, but because it revealed one. The Duke did not respond at once, and in that silence, Eliza understood that the answer was not as certain as it once had been. His gaze held hers, steady, searching, as though he was seeing her not as an intrusion, but as something far more unexpected, something that had not been accounted for within the careful order of his world. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet honesty that did not seek to hide itself. "I believe," he said slowly, "that some doors are closed because we are not prepared to open them." And Eliza felt the meaning settle within her, not as a warning, but as something far more complex, because readiness was not determined by time alone. It was shaped by choice, and as the silence deepened once more, she realized that whatever lay beyond that door was no longer a question of whether it would be opened, but when, and more importantly, who would be the one to stand before it when that moment came. Her words lingered in the silence long after they were spoken, not because they demanded an answer, but because they had already begun to unravel something neither of them could fully contain, and Eliza felt it in the way the air shifted between them, subtle, but undeniable, as though the house itself had taken notice of what had been said. The Duke did not move immediately, yet his stillness no longer felt like control. It felt like hesitation, the kind that comes not from uncertainty, but from standing too close to something long avoided. His gaze drifted once more toward the door, and this time, he did not look away as quickly. as though the barrier he had relied upon had grown thinner simply because it had been acknowledged aloud. "There are consequences to opening what was meant to remain closed," he said at last, his voice low, steady, yet carrying a weight that did not belong to caution alone, and Eliza listened. Not as someone being warned, but as someone being trusted. With something rarely spoken, she stepped slightly closer, not enough to intrude, but enough to make her presence known without distance. "And there are consequences to leaving it untouched," she replied, her voice just as quiet, yet holding a certainty that did not seek permission, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the truth between those two statements had already taken form, not in opposition, but in balance. The Duke's expression shifted then, not visibly to anyone else. Perhaps, but to her it was unmistakable. The guarded edges softened, not in weakness, but in recognition, as though he understood that what stood before him was not a question he could dismiss, but a choice he could no longer avoid. "You do not know what you are asking," he said, though the words no longer held the same resistance as before, and Eliza met his gaze steadily, her expression calm, her voice unshaken. "No," she said, "but I know what it feels like to live with something that is never allowed to end." The words settled between them with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forced, but deeply personal in a way she had not intended to reveal. And for the first time, the Duke did not respond with distance. He studied her, not as a stranger, not as an interruption, but as someone who had stepped into a truth he recognized, something unspoken yet shared, and that recognition changed something, small, but irreversible. He moved then, not away from her, but past her, his steps, measured, deliberate, carrying him toward the door without haste, yet without pause. And Eliza felt her breath still slightly as she turned to follow him, her eyes fixed on his movement, on the way his hand rose toward the surface of the wood, not touching it at first, but hovering just above, as though even now, after all that had been said, there remained a final moment of choice. The silence around them deepened, not empty, but full, waiting, and when his fingers finally made contact, the sound was almost imperceptible, yet it echoed through the corridor with a weight that seemed far greater than it should have been. Eliza did not move closer, did not reach out. She simply watched, her presence steady, because she understood that this moment did not belong to her. It belonged to him, to whatever decision he had carried within himself long before she had ever arrived. And yet, her presence had changed it, not by force, but by reflection, by allowing him to see what had always been there. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, not controlled, not distant, but something closer to honest than anything she had heard from him yet. "If this door opens," he said slowly, "it will not be closed again in the same way." And Eliza felt the truth of that settle deeply within her, not as a warning, but as a certainty, because some things, once seen, could not return to silence. She inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, not in defiance, but in understanding, and for a moment longer, he remained as he was, his hand resting against the door, his gaze lowered, as though listening not to the house, but to something within himself, and then, without another word, his fingers tightened slightly against the handle, and the silence that followed was no longer waiting. It was changing. The handle turned with a quiet resistance, not from force, but from time, as though the door itself had forgotten the motion, and Eliza felt the shift before she saw it, the subtle change in the air as the barrier that had held its silence for so long began to give way. The Duke did not rush. His movements remained steady, deliberate, as though each fraction of an inch carried weight beyond the physical act, and when the door finally opened, it did not reveal darkness as she had expected, but something far more unsettling, stillness, complete and untouched, the kind that did not belong to emptiness, but to something preserved, something held exactly as it had been left. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single lamp, its glow soft yet unwavering, casting light across a space that felt removed from time itself. Eliza stepped forward slowly, not out of urgency, but because something within her understood that hesitation would not change what had already begun. The floor beneath her feet felt different here, not colder, not warmer, but quieter, as though sound itself had been reduced within these walls. She crossed the threshold with measured steps, her gaze moving carefully across the room, taking in details that did not align with abandonment. A chair positioned near the window, its fabric untouched by dust, a table arranged with precise care, objects placed not randomly, but intentionally, as though someone had stepped away for only a moment. And yet, the absence was undeniable, not recent, not fresh, but deeply settled, the kind that does not fade with time, but reshapes it. Her eyes lifted slowly, drawn toward the far wall where a portrait hung, larger than the others she had seen in the corridor, its frame dark and unadorned. And as she moved closer, the image became clear. A woman, composed, elegant, her expression calm. Yet there was something in her gaze that did not belong to the stillness of paint, something that suggested a life that had once filled this space in ways the house had not forgotten. Eliza felt her breath steady as she stood before it, not in fear, but in recognition, not of the woman herself, but of what she represented, something that had not been released, something that had remained. And behind her, the Duke had not moved. His presence remained at the threshold, as though he could not bring himself to step fully into the space he had just opened. She did not leave, he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the control it once had, only a truth that had long been held in silence. Eliza turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge his words, her gaze softening not with pity, but with understanding, because she could feel it now, not as something hidden, but as something that had always been present, woven into every quiet corner of the house. No, she said gently, she did not. The room held their voices differently, not echoing, not fading, but absorbing them, as though even sound here was meant to remain. And Eliza stepped closer to the table, her fingers brushing lightly against its surface, not disturbing, only confirming what she already knew. This was not a place that had been forgotten. It had been kept, carefully, deliberately, not out of habit, but out of something far deeper, something that had not allowed time to move forward as it should have. She turned back toward him then, her expression calm, her voice steady. "You did not close this door to keep the past inside," she said, and he did not deny it, because there was nothing left to deny. The truth stood between them now, clear and unguarded. "You closed it because you never left it." And the silence that followed was not heavy, not oppressive, but honest in a way the rest of the house had not yet allowed itself to be. And in that moment, Eliza understood that what had been hidden behind that door was not something dangerous, not something to be feared, but something unfinished, something that had been waiting, not to remain contained, but to finally be seen. The truth did not break the silence. It settled into it, steady and undeniable, and Eliza felt the shift not in the room, but in him. The way his stillness changed from resistance into something far more fragile, something that no longer held itself together with the same careful control. He stepped forward at last, crossing the threshold he had once refused, his presence no longer lingering at the edge but entering fully into the space he had preserved for so long. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze moving slowly across the room, not as someone seeing it for the first time, but as someone who had never truly left it. His hand lowered slightly at his side, the tension within it no longer hidden, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not measured, not distant, but stripped of the barriers he had held so firmly. "I thought that if nothing changed, then nothing would truly be lost," he said. And the admission did not carry shame, only the weight of a belief that had once been necessary. Eliza listened without interruption, her presence steady, her silence offering something he had not been given before, space, not to hide, but to speak. And she understood then that this room was not only preserved in objects and stillness, it had been preserved within him, unchanged, untouched, held in place by the simple refusal to move forward. She stepped closer to the window, her gaze lifting toward the faint light beyond the glass, where the storm had softened into quiet snowfall, no longer violent, no longer relentless, but gentle in a way that felt almost unreal. "But nothing stayed the same," she said softly, her voice carrying no judgment, only truth, and he did not deny it, because there was nothing left to protect, nothing left to defend. The silence that followed was different now, no longer heavy, no longer filled with restraint. but open in a way that felt unfamiliar to both of them. And for the first time since entering the manor, Eliza felt the house itself shift, not in structure, not in sound, but in presence, as though something that had been held tightly for far too long had begun, finally, to loosen. The Duke moved closer, not toward her, but toward the center of the room, his gaze lifting once more to the portrait. And this time, there was no distance in his expression, no careful restraint, only recognition, quiet and unguarded. I remained here, he said slowly, because it was the only place where she still existed, and Eliza turned to face him fully, her expression calm, her eyes steady, because she understood that what he spoke was not illusion, but memory held too tightly to be released. She does not exist here, she said gently, and the words were not meant to take anything from him, but to return something he had not allowed himself to have. She exists in what you carry, not in what you have kept unchanged. The truth settled into the room with a quiet certainty, and for a moment, he did not respond, his gaze fixed not on her, not on the portrait, but somewhere between the two, as though he was seeing something for the first time that had always been there. And then, slowly, something shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in the way his posture eased, in the way the tension in his expression gave way to something quieter, something closer to acceptance than resistance. Eliza watched him carefully, not with expectation, but with understanding, because she knew that change did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, quietly. In moments like this, when truth was no longer something to avoid, but something to face, and as the silence settled around them once more, it no longer felt like something that confined, but something that allowed space to move forward. The room remained as it had been, unchanged in its form, but no longer untouched in its meaning. And for the first time since the door had opened, Eliza realized that what had been hidden here was not something meant to remain forever, but something that had been waiting for the moment it could finally be released, not through force, but through understanding. And as she stood there, within a space that had once refused to move beyond the past, she understood that this was not an ending, but the quiet beginning of something neither of them had yet allowed themselves to imagine. The room did not change, not in its structure, not in its quiet arrangement, yet everything within it felt different, as though the weight it had carried for so long had finally begun to loosen, and Eliza stood in that stillness, aware that what had shifted could not be undone. The Duke remained near the center of the room, his gaze no longer fixed on the past, but no longer avoiding it either, and for the first time, his presence did not feel bound to this place. It felt separate from it, as though he had taken a step that could not be reversed. Even if the room itself remained untouched, the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was open, allowing something new to exist where before there had only been restraint. Eliza moved slowly toward the door, not to leave abruptly, but because she understood that this moment, fragile as it was, did not belong to confinement. It belonged to movement, to what came after. And when she reached the threshold, she paused, turning slightly back toward him, her expression calm, her voice quiet but certain. "This room will not hold her anymore," she said, and the words did not take anything away. They returned something he had not allowed himself to reclaim, and he did not argue, because there was nothing left to resist. His gaze met hers fully now, without distance, without the guarded restraint that had defined every moment before this one. And in that look, there was something new, something that did not belong to the past at all, something that had only begun the moment she stepped into his world. "No," he said softly, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than anything he had spoken before. Eliza inclined her head slightly, acknowledging not just his words, but the change behind them, and then she stepped into the corridor once more, the air beyond the room no longer as cold, no longer as distant, as though the house itself had begun to release what it had held for too long. The shadows still remained, the silence still lingered, but neither felt as impenetrable as before, because something within them had shifted, something that could not return to what it had been. The Duke followed after a moment, not immediately, but without hesitation, and as he crossed the threshold, the door behind him remained open, not by accident, not by neglect, but by choice. Eliza did not look back at it, because she did not need to. She understood what it meant. And as they moved together through the corridor, their steps no longer separate, no longer uncertain. The space between them held something quiet and unspoken, not defined, not declared, but present in a way that did not require explanation. They reached the end of the hall where the light grew stronger, where the house began to resemble something closer to what it had once been, and Eliza paused there, her gaze lifting slightly as the faint light of morning began to filter through the distant windows, soft and steady, replacing the storm that had brought her here in the first place. She exhaled slowly, the tension she had carried easing in a way she had not expected, and when she turned to him once more, her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had seen enough to understand what came next. "The storm has passed," she said, and the words held more than their simple meaning. They carried the weight of everything that had changed within these walls, and he understood it, not as an ending, but as a beginning. His gaze held hers, steady and clear, and for the first time, there was no distance left between who he had been and who he might become. "Then you are free to leave," he said, and the words were spoken without expectation, without demand, simply offered, and Eliza did not answer immediately. Because the choice before her was no longer as simple as it once had been, she looked past him briefly, toward the open corridor, toward the house that had revealed more than it had hidden, and then back to him, her expression unchanged, yet carrying a quiet resolve that had not been there before. "Freedom is not always leaving," she said softly, and the meaning settled between them with a clarity that needed no further explanation. The silence that followed was not uncertain. It was complete, and as the first light of morning reached further into the hall, touching the stone, softening the shadows, it revealed not an ending, but something far more enduring, that sometimes the wrong path does not lead us away from where we belong, but directly toward it, and some hearts only learn to beat again when they are finally seen in the light they have spent so long avoiding.